Officer, I am standing on my own property. I suggest you check the as before you make a no
We
label.
can't toward the vehicle.
I will not. Officer, I am standing on my own property. I suggest you
Care who you think you are, lady.
step toward the no. I have done nothing unlawful and you provided no reasonable arguable suspicion.
What's it? Hands behind your back. You're resisting. Ma'am, I need you to step back.
Step back. I'm standing right where I live.
Ma'am, I'm placing you under arrest for disturbing the peace.
It was 3:40 on a humid Tuesday afternoon in the historic district of Savannah, Georgia, when Officer Garrett Hauer made a decision so reckless, so completely without legal foundation, that it would end his career in law enforcement within 72 hours. The elderly woman standing on the sidewalk in front of that wrought iron fence wasn't a vagrant. She wasn't a trespasser. She was retired Chief Judge Camille Braithwaite, a 75-year-old black woman who had presided over the Georgia Court of Appeals for 40 years before stepping down, and who had owned that historic estate for longer than Garrett Hauer had been alive. She was waiting for her granddaughter's school bus. What happened in the next 3 minutes would cost Officer Hauer his badge, cost the city of Savannah $750,000, and permanently reshape the department's use of force policies. Because his own body camera captured every single second of it. Before we break down this case of extraordinary judicial vindication, tell us, have you ever had to stand your ground when you were clearly in the right? Drop your answer in the comments and subscribe right now, because what you're about to see is so breathtaking in its arrogance, you almost won't believe it's real. Camille Braithwaite had not always been the kind of woman who scared people just by walking into a room. That had taken years. 40 years to be exact. 40 years of early mornings, thick case files, and a courtroom where every word she spoke carried the full weight of Georgia law. She had earned her reputation the same way she earned everything else in her life. One careful, deliberate step at a time. She grew up in Savannah, the daughter of a school teacher and a postal worker, who told her every single night that the law was either a shield or a weapon, and that it was her job to make sure it stayed a shield. She listened. She graduated top of her class at Spelman College, then powered through Emory University School of Law at a time when very few black women were welcomed through those doors. She didn't ask for a welcome. She simply walked in and got to work. By the time she was 34, she was arguing cases that set statewide precedents. By 42, she was appointed to the bench. By 50, she was Chief Judge of the Georgia Court of Appeals, a title that came with a heavy robe, an even heavier responsibility, and a reputation that made seasoned attorneys straighten their ties when they heard her name. In 40 years on the bench, she had presided over more than 12,000 cases. She had written opinions that became required reading in law schools across the South. She had overturned wrongful convictions, corrected unconstitutional procedures, and sent more than a few arrogant lawyers home to rethink their careers. She did all of it without raising her voice. She never had to. Her calm was the most powerful thing in any room she entered. She retired at 73, on her own terms, to the same historic home in Savannah's Victorian district where she had lived for 31 years. It was a tall, proud house with a wide front porch, wrought iron fencing, and a magnolia tree in the yard that was older than the neighborhood itself. She loved that house the way she loved the law. Deeply, quietly, and without needing anyone else to understand why. Her days in retirement were peaceful. She read, she cooked, she called her daughter in Atlanta every Sunday morning, and every Tuesday and Thursday afternoon, she walked to the end of her front walk, stood near the iron gate, and waited for the school bus that brought her 9-year-old granddaughter, Maya, home from Gadsden Elementary. It was a small thing. But to Camille Braithwaite, standing on that sidewalk, watching that little girl's face light up when she spotted her grandmother, that was the whole point of everything. That was what the law was supposed to protect. She had no way of knowing that on one ordinary Tuesday, a police cruiser would slow down, and all of that peace would be shattered in 3 minutes flat. Garrett Hauer had wanted to be a police officer since he was 11 years old, and somewhere along the way, that dream had curdled into something ugly. He joined the Savannah Police Department at 24. Fresh out of a 2-year criminal justice program, full of confidence and very short on patience. His instructors at the academy had flagged him twice for excessive assertiveness during training scenarios. His supervisor in his first year had written in his performance review that he struggles to de-escalate. Neither warning slowed him down. Hauer was 31 now, with 7 years on the force and a chip on his shoulder the size of a courthouse. He wasn't a large man, but he carried himself like one. Chest out, jaw tight, hand always hovering near his belt like he was expecting a fight. He had a habit of talking to people the way a hammer talks to a nail. One way, one direction, end of conversation. He worked the historic district by choice. He had requested the assignment twice, because in his mind, the neighborhood was getting soft. Too many unfamiliar faces, he said. Too many people who didn't look like they belonged. His fellow officers had learned to nod and change the subject when he talked like that. It was easier than arguing. He had a pattern, though most of his colleagues wouldn't have called it that. He called it proactive policing. He liked to slow his cruiser near parks, bus stops, and upscale blocks when he spotted someone who made him, as he once put it, do a double take. In the 7 months before that Tuesday afternoon, he had stopped 11 pedestrians in the historic district without a single arrest to show for it. 11 stops. 0 crimes. Every single person he stopped was black. Internal Affairs didn't know about this yet. His sergeant had heard vague whispers but hadn't pulled the data. The department had no system in place to track stop patterns by officer. A gap that Camille Braithwaite would one day personally close. On that Tuesday, Hauer was driving his usual loop through the Victorian district when he spotted a woman standing near the iron gate of one of the neighborhood's grandest homes. She was elderly, well-dressed, completely still, and totally calm. She didn't look distressed. She wasn't blocking anything. She wasn't doing a single thing wrong. But in Garrett Hauer's mind, she looked out of place. That thought, 3 small destructive words, was enough. He pulled the cruiser to the curb, put it in park, and stepped out with his chest already puffed and his voice already set to command. He did not check the property records. He did not check the address. He did not stop to ask himself a single reasonable question. He just got out of the car and walked toward the woman who had spent 40 years learning exactly how to handle men like him. Camille heard the cruiser before she saw it. The slow roll of tires on warm pavement, the deliberate crawl of a car that wasn't passing through. It was stopping. She turned her head, saw the patrol car at the curb, and felt the particular stillness that comes not from fear, but from recognition. She had seen this kind of stop before. Not from this side of it, but she had read about it, ruled on it, and written about it more times than she could count. She stayed where she was. Her hands were at her sides. Her posture was exactly what it always was, upright, unhurried, and completely composed. Hauer stepped out of the car and walked toward her with the kind of stride that was meant to make people step back. Camille did not step back. "Ma'am." His voice was flat and clipped. "What are you doing out here?" "I am waiting for my granddaughter's school bus," Camille said. "She arrives at 3:52. "You live here?" "I do. I have owned this property for 31 years. Hauer looked at the house, then back at her, and something shifted in his expression. Not belief, but irritation, as if her answer had inconvenienced him. "I'm going to need to see some ID." Camille looked at him steadily. "Officer, I am standing on the sidewalk in front of my own home. May I ask what your reasonable, articulable suspicion is for this stop?" The question landed like a stone in still water. Most people Hauer stopped didn't know that phrase. Most people didn't know that under Georgia law, a police officer needed specific, observable facts. Not a feeling, not a hunch, to legally justify demanding identification from a pedestrian. Camille knew the statute by heart. She had cited it in written opinions. Hauer's jaw tightened. "I'm asking the questions here. And I am asking mine," she said without a single change in tone. "You have approached me on my own property without cause. I am not obligated to produce identification without legal justification for this stop. What is yours?" "You were loitering." "I was standing. Loitering requires intent to commit a crime. Standing in front of one's own home does not meet that standard." He stared at her. She could see it happening behind his eyes, the moment a man who is used to compliance realizes he isn't going to get any. She had watched it happen in her courtroom 100 times. It never ended well for the man. "You think you're a lawyer or something," he said. "Or something," Camille replied. She was not trying to embarrass him. She was not being reckless. She was simply doing what she had done for 4 decades, stating the law clearly and calmly, and expecting it to be respected. It was the only language she had ever trusted. It was the language Garrett Hauer did not speak. What happened next took less than 90 seconds, but it would be studied, reviewed, and replayed for years. Hauer's face changed. The professional mask slipped, and what replaced it wasn't anger exactly. It was something colder, something that had been waiting for a reason. He took one step closer to Camille, closing the space between them in a way that was meant to intimidate, to make her shrink back, to remind her that he was the one with the badge and the gun. Camille did not shrink. "I'm gonna say this one more time," he said, his voice dropping low. "ID. Now." "And I will say this one more time," Camille replied, her voice so steady it was almost gentle. "You have not provided legal justification for this stop. I am on my own property. I am not required to comply. You're obstructing. I am conversing. There is a legal difference." That was the moment. Later, when attorneys and oversight boards and journalists picked through every frame of the body cam footage, they would point to that exact second, 3:40 scene on the timestamp, as the point of no return. Hauer reached out, grabbed Camille by the arm, and spun her toward the wrought iron fence she had painted herself the summer before. Camille gasped, not in panic, but in shock. The pain in her shoulder was immediate and sharp. "Hands behind your back," Hauer said. "You are making a very serious mistake," Camille said. Her voice was still controlled, but there was something in it now, not fear and not anger. It was the voice she used when she had already decided how something was going to end. "Officer Hauer, your body camera is currently filming your resignation." He snapped the cuffs on anyway. The wrought iron gate dug into her hip as he pinned her. Down the block, a yellow school bus had just turned the corner. It slowed as it reached the house, and the doors opened. A 9-year-old girl with 2 braids and a purple backpack stepped off the bus, took 3 steps toward the gate, and stopped completely still. Maya had never seen her grandmother in handcuffs. Across the street, a retired couple stood frozen on their porch. Next door, a woman pruning her roses had put down her clippers and pulled out her phone. The body cam was rolling. A neighbor's security camera had a clear angle on the fence. 3 separate recordings were capturing every second of what Garrett Hauer had just done. Camille stood straight, even in cuffs, even against her own fence. She looked at Maya and gave her the smallest nod. The one that meant, "I am all right. I am in control. Do not be afraid." But Camille was already thinking, already cataloging, already building in her mind the case that was going to take Garrett Hauer's career apart piece by careful piece. Maya didn't cry. That was the thing that stayed with the neighbors for a long time afterward. The little girl didn't cry. She stood at the edge of the yard with her backpack still on her shoulders, watching her grandmother with an expression that was too old for a 9-year-old face. Serious, watchful, waiting. "Baby, go inside," Camille said, her voice firm and clear, despite the cuffs at her wrists. "The key is under the blue pot. Call your mother. Tell her to come home." Maya looked at Officer Hauer once, a long, quiet look, and then turned and walked up the porch steps without a word. She found the key. She went inside. Within 4 minutes, she had reached her mother in Atlanta. The neighbors were not as quiet. Margaret and Don Tillman, who had lived across the street for 22 years and had attended Camille's retirement celebration 3 years prior, were already on their porch with a phone recording the scene. Margaret had her hand pressed over her mouth. Don was on his cell phone with 911, which struck everyone later as deeply ironic, calling the police to report what the police were doing. From next door, Patricia Osei had abandoned her roses entirely and was recording from her driveway, shaking her head slowly. She had known Camille since the day she moved in. She had borrowed her cake stand twice, shared her Thanksgiving table once, and called her for legal advice more times than she could count. "Garrett," she said loudly from her driveway, not shouting, just projecting, the way a woman says a name when she wants it to land with weight. "Do you know who that woman is?" Hauer ignored her. He was directing Camille toward the patrol car, one hand still gripping her arm. "That is Judge Braithwaite," Patricia called out. "That is the Chief Judge of the Georgia Court of Appeals. You are arresting a federal judge on her own front walk." Hauer opened the back door of the cruiser and guided Camille inside. His face was unreadable, but his hands, one witness later said, were moving a little faster than before. By the time the cruiser pulled away from the curb, 4 phones had footage of the arrest. Margaret Tillman had already texted her daughter, who worked at the Savannah Morning News. Patricia Osei had posted to the neighborhood Facebook group, where the message spread in under 10 minutes. Don Tillman had reached a city councilman he knew personally. The school bus driver, who had watched everything from 40 feet away and had not moved his bus until the cruiser left, sat very still for a moment. Then he picked up his radio. "Dispatch," he said quietly, "you're going to want to make some calls." The neighborhood was already moving before the cruiser had turned the corner. And in the back seat, calm as a courthouse, Camille Braithwaite was already composing her first statement in her head. The Savannah Police Department's 3rd Precinct on a Tuesday afternoon was usually quiet. A few officers finishing paperwork. A desk sergeant handling calls. The low hum of a building doing ordinary work. That changed at 4:11 p.m. Sergeant Dennis Albright was at the front desk when the door opened and Garrett Hauer walked in with a woman in handcuffs. Albright looked up the way he always did, a quick glance, half attention, ready to look back down. Then he actually looked. He knew that face. Every officer in the Savannah Department knew that face. Chief Judge Camille Braithwaite had presided over cases involving their department for decades. She had ruled on use of force policies, evidence procedures, and civil rights complaints that directly shaped how they did their jobs. Her portrait hung in the lobby of the Chatham County Courthouse. There was a scholarship at the police academy named after her. The color did not just drain from Sergeant Albright's face, it left entirely. "Hauer," he said, and his voice came out very carefully, the way a person speaks when they are trying very hard not to shout. "What have you done?" "Obstruction and resisting," Hauer said, moving toward the processing desk like this was any other Tuesday. She refused ID and wouldn't comply. Albright was already standing up. "Take those cuffs off." Hauer stopped. "Sarge, she was." I said, "Take them off." Albright came around the desk and for a moment the two men stared at each other. Hauer still not fully understanding, Albright already calculating the size of the disaster he was looking at. Camille said nothing. She stood between them with the perfect stillness of a woman who has spent 40 years waiting for other people to finish talking so the real work could begin. Hauer removed the cuffs. Camille rubbed her wrists once, slowly, and then looked at Sergeant Albright with an expression that was not angry and not satisfied. It was professional. "I will need the officer's full name, badge number, and a copy of his body cam footage submitted to my attorney by 9 a.m. tomorrow," she said. "I will also need a written incident report filed tonight. I trust that will not be a problem." It was not a question. Albright said, "No ma'am, no problem at all." He personally drove her home in an unmarked car. He apologized 4 times on the way. Camille accepted each apology with a small nod and said very little. She was thinking about patterns. She was thinking about the 10 other people who had been stopped in her neighborhood by the same officer and had not known how to say his name on a police report. She was thinking about what it means when a system protects the Hauers of the world just long enough to hurt everyone it was supposed to serve. By the time Albright pulled into her driveway, she had already decided. She wasn't going to just file a complaint. She was going to take the whole thing apart. The body cam footage went public at 7:43 the following morning. By noon, it had been viewed over 2 million times. By evening, it was leading every local newscast in Georgia and had been picked up by national outlets. By the following morning, it was everywhere. The footage was damning in a way that was almost too clean. Camille standing calmly. Camille asking the right questions in the right order. Hauer unable to provide a single legal answer. The moment of physical force. The handcuffs. Maya stepping off the bus, neighbors recording from across the street. Every second of it, steady and clear on Hauer's own camera. The comments, the calls, the headlines, They all said the same thing in different words. He picked the wrong woman. But Camille's attorney, a sharp civil rights lawyer named Dara Okonkwo, was already looking past the footage. She had filed a public records request within hours of the arrest, and what came back over the next several days told a story that was bigger and uglier than one bad cop on one Tuesday afternoon. Internal Affairs pulled Hauer's stop records going back 14 months. The numbers were stark. In a neighborhood that was majority white, Hauer had made 34 pedestrian stops. 31 of the 34 people stopped were black. Of the 34 stops, only 2 resulted in any follow-up action, and both of those were dismissed. 0 arrests. 0 crimes. 34 stops without a single justified outcome. The department had no system for tracking this. No algorithm, no review process, no supervisor who had looked at Hauer's pattern of behavior and asked a hard question. The data existed, it was all logged in the system, but no one had connected the dots, or more accurately, no one had been required to. 3 of the people Hauer had previously stopped came forward after the footage went public. A 26-year-old man who had been walking home from work, a woman in her 50s who had been sitting on a public bench reading, a teenage boy who had been waiting for a ride outside his uncle's house. Each of them had complied. Each of them had gone home shaken. None of them had filed a complaint, because none of them had believed a complaint would go anywhere. That was the part that settled into Camille's chest like a stone. Not what had happened to her. She had the vocabulary, the credentials, and the connections to fight back. It was what had happened to the ones who didn't. Dara Okonkwo told her she had a case worth well over $1 million. Camille nodded. Then she told Dara what she actually wanted. She didn't want a number. She wanted a system. One that would catch the next Hauer before the next arrest, before the next teenager on a bench, before the next grandmother at a gate. She wanted a reform with teeth. And she had just been handed the leverage to get one. Garrett Hauer's termination hearing was held on a Thursday morning in a conference room at City Hall, and it lasted just under 2 hours. Hauer arrived with a union representative and a folder of paperwork. He left without his badge. The evidence against him was thorough and straightforward. The body cam footage, the stop records, the 3 witnesses who had come forward, the Internal Affairs finding that he had violated department policy on reasonable suspicion, use of force, and conduct toward a civilian no fewer than 7 times during the 3-minute encounter alone. His union representative spoke for 11 minutes. The panel deliberated for less than 30. Hauer lost his job, his pension rights for the years in question, and any future eligibility for law enforcement employment in the state of Georgia. He did not make a statement on the way out. A photographer caught him in the parking lot, shoulders down, jaw tight, staring at the pavement. He looked, more than anything, confused, like a man who had never once considered that the rules might apply to him too. The city settled with Camille Braithwaite for $750,000 3 weeks later, before the civil suit ever reached a courtroom. The settlement came with no admission of wrongdoing from the department, which was standard language that everyone understood to be meaningless in this particular case. The footage existed. The stop records existed. The admission was in the evidence. The day the settlement was signed, Camille drove herself home, walked up her porch steps, and sat in the wide wooden chair she kept near the magnolia tree. Maya was in school. The street was quiet. The afternoon light came through the branches the way it always did in October, golden and long and slow. She sat there for a while without doing anything. Then she went inside, made herself a cup of tea, and called Dara Okonkwo to begin the next phase of the work. She did not hold a press conference. She did not give an interview about how she felt or what it was like to be vindicated or how it felt to win. She had not done any of this to win. She had done it because 34 people had been stopped in her neighborhood, and only one of them had known how to fight back. And that was 33 people too many. The gavel had fallen. Now came the part that actually mattered. The Braithwaite Accountability Reform was signed into city policy on a cold Monday morning in February, 14 months after the arrest. Camille sat in the 3rd row of the city council chambers, not at the front, not at the podium, just in the third row, and watched the council vote 8-1 in favor of the policy she had spent over a year designing. The reform did three things that the Savannah Police Department had never done before. First, it created a mandatory stop data review system. Every officer's pedestrian and vehicle stops would now be logged, analyzed quarterly, and cross-referenced for patterns by race, location, and outcome. Any officer whose stop data showed a pattern similar to Howard's would be flagged automatically and referred for review, not after a complaint was filed, but before the next stop happened. Second, it required annual community oversight audits conducted not by the department itself, but by an independent civilian board with full access to records. The board would include legal professionals, community members, and at least one person who had been the subject of a documented, unjustified stop. Third, and this was the piece Camille had fought hardest for, the city established the Braithwaite Legal Literacy Fund, using the majority of her $750,000 settlement. The fund would provide free Know Your Rights training in every Savannah public school, starting in 6th grade. It would teach children the same things Camille had known standing at that fence: what reasonable articulable suspicion means when you are and are not required to show ID, how to document an encounter, and where to report a violation. She had named it not for herself but because no one would let her name it anything else. On the afternoon the reform was signed, she went home, picked up Maya from the school bus at 3:52, and walked her inside for a snack. Maya, who had grown 4 inches and lost 2 teeth since that Tuesday in October, dropped her backpack at the door and said, "Grandma, did you win today?" Camille thought about that for a moment. "We started something today," she said. "Winning takes longer." Maya seemed to accept that. She climbed onto the kitchen stool and reached for an apple. Outside, the magnolia tree was bare for winter, but the iron fence stood exactly as it always had, solid, quiet, and unmoved by anything the world had thrown at it. Just like the woman who had owned it for 31 years.